These are some of the comments you see about Saddam Hussein today on TikTok, or YouTube, or Instagram. Comments from real people praising a dictator. It's quite bizarre. Especially when you consider that it wasn't too long ago when these were the images seen in Iraq. Clearly, something has changed. The question's just, what? I think I have an idea. We're in a courtroom somewhere in Iraq in 2006. The man on trial is Saddam Hussein, and he's about to receive his sentence. Stand up. We're going to read the verdict, so stand up, the judge says. Saddam pretends he doesn't hear him. He already knows what the verdict will be, so he's not going to do anything they tell him to. Make him stand, the judge says to two nearby guards who lift him on his feet. The court has decided to sentence Saddam Hussein al-Majid to death. Immediately, Saddam begins to shout out into the room, wishing death upon the invaders and condemning the court, among other things. But it doesn't matter. His threats and curses don't strike fear in anyone anymore, especially not the judge. His name is Rauf Rashid Abd al-Rahman. He replaced the previous judge, who was criticised for being too lenient with Saddam and his top officials, something he doesn't intend on being. In fact, the new judge has a very special connection to Saddam. See, in the 1980s, Abd al-Rahman was tortured by Hussein's security forces, something that happened a lot to people Saddam's regime considered suspicious. Then, in 1988, his hometown Halabja was attacked with chemical bombs and artillery shells, loaded with nerve gas. It's a particularly cruel weapon. If it doesn't kill you straight away, it most likely will eventually, weeks, months, or even years later. It has no place, anywhere. Abd al-Rahman lost several family members during the massacre, and it was all ordered by Saddam. He hates him. That's why he was chosen, and he's going to make sure that Saddam gets the justice he deserves. But, ironically, the thing that eventually brought Saddam down actually had nothing to do with him, and for once in his life, he actually is innocent. On September 11th, 2001, the US is hit with the largest terrorist attack in history.
Today, our fellow citizens, our very freedom came under attack in a series of deliberate and deadly terrorist acts.
Almost 3,000 people die that day. It's the terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, that claims responsibility.
This is a day when all Americans from every walk of life unite in our resolve for justice and peace. Yet we go forward to defend freedom and all that is good and just in our world.
It doesn't take long for the initial shock and fear to turn into anger. It's as if this attack has managed to unite an otherwise politically divided nation in an instant, and they're all in complete agreement on one thing: revenge.
Whether we bring our enemies to justice or bring justice to our enemies, justice will be done.
And it doesn't take long before the first American tanks roll across the border into Afghanistan, home of Al-Qaeda. But things don't go quite as smoothly as expected. See, the Al-Qaeda don't use uniforms. They don't walk around with banners or armbands that identify who they are. They're dressed as regular people. They hide among civilians, and they are incredibly hard to fight. At the same time, suspicions start to form that the Al-Qaeda haven't been operating on their own. Naturally, they must have had help from someone. And so, the US turn their sights on Saddam Hussein. To most countries, he's a ruthless dictator who's been tyrannizing the Iraqi people for 2 decades. And they aren't wrong. So it wouldn't be impossible to believe that he was complicit in the attack in some way. In fact, the US claims that Saddam has supported Al-Qaeda and is hiding several terrorists in Iraq.
And it has aided, trained, and harbored terrorists, including operatives of Al-Qaeda.
Ironically, Saddam is actually an opponent of Al-Qaeda. He fears them. But even despite knowing this, the US is still convinced that Saddam has several weapons of mass destruction. which he's hiding and plans to give to Al-Qaeda, and President George W. Bush even claims that Saddam is part of a so-called axis of evil that wants to destroy Western freedom and democracy, even though they don't actually have any real evidence that he had anything to do with the September 11th attacks, or that an axis of evil even exists at all.
Using chemical, biological, or one-day nuclear weapons obtained with the help of Iraq, the terrorists could fulfill their stated ambitions and kill thousands or hundreds of thousands of innocent people in our country or any other.
But Saddam claims that he's gotten rid of them a long time ago, and surprisingly, he's not lying. There are no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, but the US doesn't believe him. So in early 2003, the US invades Iraq along with a coalition of other countries. Saddam is shocked. He never imagined the US would go that far, especially since he really didn't have anything to do with Al-Qaeda, or an axis of evil for that matter. But when troops, tanks and fighter jets suddenly flood across the border into Iraq, Saddam faces a reality he is utterly unprepared for. So, only a few weeks after the invasion, Saddam has to flee Baghdad with his two sons, Uday and Qusay, and his grandson, Mustafa. Uday and Qusay decide to flee with Mustafa to the city of Mosul near the Syrian border. Here, they know a wealthy and powerful clan leader, Nawaf al-Zaidan. He's previously sworn allegiance to their father, so naturally he has to take them in. And when they get there, things actually seem to calm down for a bit. In fact, it's so good at Nawaf's place that they somewhat forget they have the entire American army and a coalition of Western superpowers searching for them. They spend most of their time just lounging on the couch and playing video games. But it doesn't take long for American troops to move into the city. Naturally, Nawaf starts to get nervous, because if the American troops were to suddenly find Saddam's two sons in his house, he knows how that would end. He also knows that you don't just tell Uday and Qusay what to do. People have been killed for much less. So, carefully, Nawaf tries to persuade them to leave the city. But they aren't going anywhere. It's not even up for discussion. If he brings it up again, the Americans will be the last he has to worry about. Nawaf is now desperate. The US has already begun questioning all of Saddam's old associates. It's only a matter of time before they get to him. If he has any plans of surviving this, he needs to do something, and quick. So, shortly after, Nawaf leaves his home in the dead of night and drives straight to an American military base, where he tells them he has been sheltering Uday and Qusay in his home for several days. And by lunchtime the next day, an entire platoon of soldiers along with several special forces arrive at the house where Uday and Qusay are hiding. The two scramble to barricade what they can and arm themselves. They only have a single bodyguard to protect them, so even Mustafa is told to fight, and then they wait. In the meantime, the soldiers surround the house and order them to surrender, but they get no response. So, 10 minutes later, a team of special forces breach and enter the house. Almost immediately, the soldiers are faced with heavy gunfire from the 4 defenders who have barricaded themselves on the second floor. So, the soldiers turn to plan B. And suddenly, grenades and rockets rain down on the house. Just as they recover from one barrage, they're hit with another. After 4 hours of non-stop bombardment, it finally stops. Nearly half of the house has been reduced to rubble. And when a small unit of special forces move through the toppled walls, they find the only survivor of the attack, Mustafa, Qusay's 14-year-old son. He's holding an AK-47, and when he sees the soldiers approaching him, he turns it directly at them and starts shooting. But he misses, and as the soldiers return fire, Mustafa is killed. And thus, the second and third names on the US Most Wanted list die. But the man at the top of the list is still missing, and while his sons were hiding in the suburbs of Mosul, he was on the run. While hiding, Saddam's troops are basically left to fend for themselves, and it doesn't take long for the coalition forces to dismantle the entire Iraqi army. So, as Iraqi soldiers and police abandon their posts, entire cities fall into lawlessness. Violence and death tolls skyrocket in a few months as insurgents and Al-Qaeda fill the vacuum left by Saddam's army. The US blames the violence on supporters of Saddam's regime and believes capturing him will put an end to it once and for all. There's just one problem. They can't find him. It's like he's vanished into thin air. Until a group of American soldiers captures one of Saddam's messengers. It doesn't take them long to persuade him to point them towards Saddam's last hiding place, Tikrit. On December 13th, 2003, a group of hardened American soldiers and special forces surround a small farm. They move quietly. If this really is where Saddam is hiding, the entire area could be rigged with traps. There could be soldiers with AK-47s hiding around the corner. But they find nothing. Neither the farmer nor the farm appear suspicious. Then they see something that seems a little unusual. A rug lying in the middle of the ground, almost as if it's hiding something. Carefully, they remove the rug and find it covers a small hatch. It's unlocked. One of the soldiers slowly opens it to reveal a small, narrow cavity. It's barely big enough for a man to lie down flat, but sure enough, down in the darkness lies a figure. "Come out with your hands over your head," the soldiers shout. And out crawls a man with long matted hair and a scruffy beard. He looks dirty, not exactly the image of a powerful dictator, but there's no doubt about it. It's him. And with his capture, his Iraq is officially, finally, gone. And in its place stands a war-torn and broken country where decades of tyranny and fear has reached a boiling point. Finally, they're allowed to hate him. And they do. In fact, the anger against Saddam and all those associated with him is so great that 2 of his lawyers actually get assassinated. And when the US appoints the country itself to handle the trial, Saddam knows what awaits him: death. And sure enough, that's the sentence the judge reads to Saddam in the courtroom almost 3 years after his capture. And just a little over a month later, the day of his execution arrives. He's standing in a dark basement surrounded by men with balaclavas. In front of him hangs a thick, long rope. He looks slightly nervous. He's refused to wear the usual black hood that's normally given to prisoners about to be executed. One of the executioners shouts at Saddam to go to hell. Saddam replies, "Iraq is hell," before he begins to recite the Shahada, the Islamic creed. As he's about to recite it a third time, one of the executioners pulls the lever that controls the trapdoor beneath him. And so, a dictator who ruled through fear, who gassed his own people, who ordered the torture and execution of thousands, ends his life at the end of a rope in a dark basement, telling his executioners that Iraq has become hell. The irony is that his downfall didn't come from any of these atrocities, but from weapons he didn't have and connections that never existed. In the years that followed, more than 200,000 Iraqi civilians are estimated to have been killed as a direct consequence of the invasion. Some estimate even more. On top of that, millions of people had no access to medical care, clean water, or other basic services. Things that should have been provided by the coalition. The war that was meant to liberate the Iraqi people has ended up doing the opposite. Perhaps that's why, scrolling through social media today, you'll find something unexpected. People praising Saddam. They see all of the lies that led to the invasion, the civilians killed by coalition rockets, and suddenly it becomes easier to forget the terror that came before. As if one tragedy could somehow erase another. But history isn't a balance sheet. One horror doesn't cancel out another. And sometimes, being right about one thing can make us forget all the ways someone was wrong. In an interview with the FBI after his capture, Saddam admitted he would have sought weapons of mass destruction again, given the chance. And when asked if he had any concerns of what he had done, of the innocent lives he had taken, of the thousands of homes and families he had destroyed, the answer was clear: no.